Hello everyone, welcome to our fifth webinar today by Data Jeddah. I am Helen Clary and will be with me today Renad Al-Uri. And here is by Data Jeddah team behind the scenes Yasmin, Hassan, Afnan and Najla Abdullah. Before we start, I want to say a quick shout out to the upcoming By Data Global virtual event will be on November 11 to 15. Tickets are available now on their website, so don't miss it. For today, our speaker, Fahad Alhazmi, he is a PhD student and adjunct lecturer at Brooklyn College. Along with his studies and huge interest in neuroscience, he prepared for us today a really interesting topic about data science application in neuroscience. And we all looking forward to see what you got for us, Fahad. So, mic is yours. Fahad?
Yeah. So thank you so much for this opportunity. First, I thank you for having me today to talk about one of the topics that is dear to my heart, and it is actually what I do in my PhD, which is the intersection between AI, psychology, and neuroscience. So in this topic, I'm not really gonna touch on any application or any coding of how to do any problem, but I'm just going to talk more about the history of how ideas from AI were relevant in psychology and neuroscience, and how ideas from the history and research in psychology, problems in psychology, were very relevant for neuroscience problems today. So this topic is actually usually very technical. I looked at other when I was researching for this topic, I found that all the other treatments, they are either very too much technical for the layperson to understand much from those topics, or they are too simple, to a point where I feel like they actually misrepresent the beauty the beauty of this interaction. So I hope I can give you this balanced treatment where I can talk about the history, and also I hope that you will appreciate that the shared history between these three fields. So let me first share my screen. Uh, is it possible to share my screen? Oh yeah, okay.
Haya, can you please stop sharing so Fahad can share his
Uh,
screen?
okay. So just 1 second. Okay, I believe that you can now see the screen right now.
Yes, it's clear.
Yeah, okay. So let me start the recording here. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about myself. So as you said, I am a PhD student at the Graduate Center at City University of New York, and also at Brooklyn College. Uh, my major is in psychology. This is like the sub major where I am doing, like the track is behavioral and cognitive neuroscience. I am interested in cognitive science. So there is this idea in cognitive science. It is that when you look at the brain, you should look at the brain as an information processing system. It's like a computer. So this was actually one of the ideas that drew me into this field in the first place, because I was doing software engineering during my undergrad, and toward the end of my degree, I took a course in artificial intelligence, and this is where I was starting to think about the brain, and I think of the brain as a computer, and then I found a whole field that is dedicated to this idea. So this is how I actually like shifted my interest, and I went to study neuroscience and psychology. So the question of interest that I'm studying right now, this is my field of research, is the reinforcement learning, human reinforcement learning in complex environments. Basically, like when you are in complex environments where you have like multiple sources of information, or multiple sources of inputs, how do you combine those inputs and make a decision? So this is basically what I'm studying right now. So allow me, before we begin, I give you a general outline. So in the beginning, we will talk about modeling in general and what are the levels of analysis. So these are kind of meta topics or meta questions, but this is the kind of the mental models when psychologists and neuroscientists and those who are into AI, what they think about or what kind of questions they ask. So I would just give a very brief description of some of those questions. And then I'm going to talk about the psychology of learning and just take a very brief history of that beautiful field. And then we're going to talk about the perceptron, and then the classical and operant conditioning. And then I will show you how those ideas actually translate to developments in reinforcement learning, which is actually very beautiful. So then I am going to talk about the some of the examples of how AI and neuroscience can interact. So the first example is actually an idea that have been validated in AI, and then neuroscientists like took notice, say, okay, this is actually something we see in the brain. And the other idea is it is actually based in neuroscience. So it was found in the hippocampus. It's called experience replay. And then like AI researchers, they said that how we can do that in the reinforcement learning models. So I'm going to cover both of these ideas, and then we will conclude the presentation. So first, let me ask you a question. So here you see three maps of New York City. The leftmost map, these maps of the five boroughs. Okay, so you can see that each borough is colored in having a different color. And then the middle map is a subway map. So these are the major lines of the subway. And then the right map is actually an aerial view. So an aerial view of the city, is at least partial aerial view of the city. My question to you is, which of these three you think is most accurate or most representative of New York City? Which of these three maps do you think is most representative of New York City? Well, you might say maybe the one with the pictures, like the aerial view, because this is actually what New York City is. So the idea here, this might be representative of New York City, but if you think about the function of this map, like what kind of things you can do with this map, you will find it's almost useless, because you cannot really do much with this map. You might like print it and put it in your room, but you cannot use it to navigate the city. However, if you think about the other maps, those maps are actually more useful, because now at least you can use those maps to answer a very important question. How do you go from point A to point B in the city? So let's ask this question, like how do you go from, like, say, using the subway. So obviously you will actually use the subway map. However, if we change the question, if we are walking or if we are driving, then we know that the subway map will no longer be useful. And the idea here is that each map here, or each abstraction of reality, will will exaggerate some elements that are relevant to the problem we are trying to solve. So here we are trying to solve our navigation in subway. So that's how we actually somehow distort to the city, because if you look at this map, you will see that the size of Manhattan is not as large as it is, but this is actually something they always do in the maps, because the point here is not whether they can replicate the reality. The point here is that they want to see this is a functional map. This map will be used to navigate the city using the subways. So I want you to keep this idea that how maps can be used for different purposes, and think about the brain. What kind of a subway map that we will have of the brain? Is there a subway map of the brain? And if there is a subway map, uh, if there is a subway map or maps, like plural, then what this map is for? Is it a map for, like as we saw in the subway maps, there are different functions of each map. So this is something maybe neuroscientists and psychologists, they always think about, because we can study the brain. We can know a lot about the brain. We can know a lot about the activity of neurons in this area, or activity of neurons in that area, or we can know about the genes. And at the end of the day, those discoveries are all as good as the aerial view of New York City. Basically, if you don't know what is their function, you're not gonna use them. Like they're not gonna be of use. So we have to keep in mind that question: what is the subway map of New York, of the human brain? And if there is a subway map, then what this map is for? So this I so and also, if you think about the brain, we have to think about the behavior. So do you want to understand what we do in daily life to figure out like what this map is for? And this is actually one of the most crucial questions that we will see right now. So if you think, if we just take a kind of a simulation, or kind of a thought experiment, I will show you a thought experiment that will tell you like how we can organize the questions we can ask about the brain. So this kind of thought experiment, and also the levels of analysis, this is actually something that both neuroscientists, psychologists, and AI researchers who are interested in the brain, they all think, or share this view. They all share this view. So let's say that you actually sent an iPhone back to Newton. So now Newton, who lived in the 17th century, has no idea how this iPhone works. Okay, and what kind of questions Newton can ask to figure out how this iPhone works. Okay, so here are some questions. So the first questions: what are the physical components of the iPhone? Like, okay, this is the first component, this is the second component, this is the third component. So those components are the internal components of the iPhone. So we know the screen, we know the CPU, we know the memory part, we know the storage, we know like the GPU unit or whatever. So those are what are the like if we break the iPhone, those are the basic components of the iPhone. And then we can ask, what does the iPhone do? So what can I use this iPhone for? Like I can call, I can text, I can record voice notes, I can make calendar appointments, etc. So these are kind of behaviors of what the iPhone can do. And then we have how the physical components in the iPhone that we just found, how the physical components are related to the functions of the iPhone. Basically, we want to know like how the camera is related to function of taking pictures, how the speaker in the iPhone is related to the function of calling, and etc. So these might seem very obvious to us because we already have been using these tools for a long time. But think about this from a person who just see this technology for the first time. And then we want to ask, how does damaging parts of the iPhone, like internal parts or internal components, how do they change the functioning of the iPhone? How do they disrupt the functioning of the iPhone? So it's obvious that if I damage the camera, I'm no longer gonna take pictures. If I damage the speaker, I'm no longer gonna call. But not just call, I'm no longer able to actually make voice notes. Okay. So now you can see how even like if you damage the CPU, now the iPhone is no longer actually functioning because the CPU is very important. So it's a good idea to have this kind of mapping between the physical parts and the functions on the other hand. And finally, you have this question like, what is the purpose of the RAM, like random access memory? What is the purpose of CPU? So these are the internal components. We want to know what do they do. And if you look at these questions, these are all possible. And you might ask other questions, but what you can see is that for each of these questions, there is almost a whole field of neuroscience or psychology that is dedicated to answering this question. So for the first question about the physical components, this is actually what neurobiologists do with the brain. So neurobiologists will look at the cell, will look at what is the how the like the neuron and how the neurons are connected to one another. So this is more about the hardware stuff of the brain. What does the iPhone do? This is mostly about the behavior of the iPhone, what kind of function that the iPhone can do. So this is more of psychology. So this is what psychologists study. They study behavior, the human or the animal behavior. And now the two questions about the physical components and the functioning and how damaging those components affect the functioning. This is actually more into the neuropsychology or clinical psychology, because now we understand a great deal about how disruption of some parts of the brain will actually disrupt the functioning of that part. And finally, we have the question that's most closely related to computational neuroscience or computational modeling, or maybe to AI. This is the asking about the purpose of the parts of the iPhone. Like, what is the purpose of the RAM? What is the purpose of this area? What is the purpose of that area? So one guy, David Marr, in the 1980s, he came up with this idea of levels of information processing systems. So he was saying, okay, look, when we approach an information processing systems, that means a system that has an inputs, that has outputs, and then there is some transformation going on in the middle. When we approach these kinds of systems, we really have three levels of analysis or three kinds of questions that we should be aware of, and they kind of independent from one another. So you don't have to answer all these questions, but these three levels are actually just a good heuristic to how you can think about the brain. So the first level is the goal of computation, or the goal of this system. What is the goal that this system is trying to achieve? Computational goal. We will talk about some examples as we explore the brain. And then for each goal, like if the goal is like, say, the goal of the eye is to perceive reality, or the goal of this region is to do that. So now we're just talking about information processing system. We don't have to talk about the brain because we still don't know what those answers are for when it comes to the brain. The second one is called the representation and algorithms. So here we are asking, how this computational goal or computational theory, how can this be implemented? Like, what is the algorithmic steps that need to be done for this to be implemented? And we also ask another questions like about the representation, how the inputs are represented, how the outputs are represented, like how do they look like? And then we ask, how are they transformed? Like when they come to the output stage, what happened, what kind of transformations that have been like carried out. So this is the transformation is actually related to the algorithm that is being done. So the third level is called the implementation or the hardware level. So this is basically how this representation in stage two, or in the second level, how this representational algorithm, how they are realized physically. Basically, are they realized in, say, in like say in a human brain? Are they realized in a computer, or like what is the medium that will actually run all those algorithmic steps and representations? So it's generally a good idea to keep in mind that there are three levels of analysis of looking at things, and they are, as I said, they are independent. At least this is what we want to assume. And now you can see why a neuroscientist might look at the hardware and implementation, or let's say an AI researcher. You see, they might say, okay, you know what? Maybe I'm not that interested in the actual biology of the brain. I can just replicate that in the silicon, and as long as I am satisfying the goal of that computation, then I, I I think I am doing something to understand the brain or to understand the system. So this is the basic reason why it makes sense for us to use AI models to understand the brain, because we think that this is the assumption that the implementation level, the hardware level, is actually kind of independent from the representation and the algorithm that is being implemented. So with all that in mind, now I want to go into the history of learning. So in the history of learning is actually maybe one of the oldest or earliest topics of AI that has been like it goes back to 1943. So in 1943, McCulloch and Bitts, they actually came up with this idea of a neuron. It's a very simple neuron. It is just a neuron that is aimed to compute all the logical functions. So if you remember, like there is the truth table, and then you have the, if you have one and one, this is the AND function. We have inputs as like one and one, you will result, the output will be one. And then the or would be like, if the input is 1 and 0, then it will be 1. Or so this is the goal of this unit, the neural unit. And they were thinking that maybe this is how the brain, how we can like reduce the brain into this very simple neuron. So we want to make sure that that this neuron actually computes the logical functions. So this was a very simple model, because it's just like you multiply the weights. So those weights are actually set up by, like they're not learned. So you set up those weights so that you can calculate the desired functions. Um, and then it was extremely limited, obviously. And then there came this guy, the Frank Rosenblatt. And Frank Rosenblatt made these connections learnable. So he added this idea, okay, if I have a bunch of these units and maybe I have multiple layers, he actually came up like multi-layer perceptrons. You might have heard of this. This is actually in scikit-learn and in TensorFlow. So he came up with this idea, okay, if I have multiple layers of perceptrons and I have these connections, how do I make those connections modifiable by experience or by the data, so that I can represent any function. I can represent any set of inputs and outputs. So he indeed did that, and he was kind of responsible for the first AI hype. So that was in 1958, and he wrote the following in 1958. He wrote that stories about the creation of machines have human qualities have long been a fascinating province in the realm of science fiction. Yet we are about to witness the birth of such a machine capable of perceiving, recognizing, and identifying its surroundings without any human training or control. So it was a more like an exaggeration for what is really happening. But he did actually develop this simple model of recognizing, I think he recognizing cards or something. Um, so it was a very simple system that he developed, but it was very hyped, as we will see it today. So this is what Rosenblatt thought of when he was thinking about the perceptron. How do we make the changes to those weights so that we represent any function? So in order to make those changes, you would need what they call the learning rule. And the perceptron learning rule is very simple. I'm putting it here because this will be very relevant when we come to psychology, the psychology part of. But by the way, uh, actually, the McCulloch in McCulloch and Betts neuron, this was McCulloch was a neurologist, okay, and Frank Rosenblatt was actually a psychologist. So they were actually at the heart of the neuroscience sides of things or psychology side of things. And if you look at the learning rule, you will see that I will just point to the important part. So you will see this learning rate. So this learning rate will just tell you like how fast you want to change the weights. So this is just the change in the weight. I'm not considering like this is it, how I should update my weight so that I match this output. So this should be a function of the error, and this is what we see between the parentheses. So the parentheses, we have a target value and we have the output value. So this is basically what is the difference between what I experienced or what is the outcome that I got and what is my expectation. So this difference between the outcome and expectation is called the prediction error. And this prediction error is something that you can use to just update the weights and make this prediction error smaller and smaller. So as I said, this will be a key idea when we like about 12 years later. This will be a very key idea. So in Frank Rosenblatt was not the only one thinking about learning actually. So there was a whole field of learning that is quite independent or a parallel at the parallel, and there were like at the time of Rosenblatt there were like um, very intensive investigations in this field. So this is actually the tradition led by Pavlov and Skinner. Now we will talk about Pavlov and Skinner, but just so that you know, when we think about learning, what is the value of learning? What is the value of learning? Why are we always talking about learning? So obviously, the value of learning is that it's very important for survival, because remember, like if an organism or if some species, if they don't have a mechanism for changing their behavior and adapting with the environment, then they will not survive, because the predators will might change their strategies, things might change. So there have to be a way of adapting to the environment, and this is why we always talk about learning, because learning is the vehicle for this behavioral change that will result in a more survival of the organism. So this is so that's the reason why learning has been one of the central topics in psychology. So Pavlov, he was one of the first people who studied classical conditioning. And in classical conditioning, the core idea is that how do I make association between two separate events that are not connected before? How do we learn? How do we make like an association between these two events? So I'm gonna show you this example between the dog and the meat. This is just kind of a typical example of what this actually means, and this is actually pretty similar to the experiments that Pavlov himself actually was doing. So as you can see in the first row, this is what we already have in the nature. So when the dog sees this piece of meat, the dog will salivate. So this is a natural behavior. This is why it's called it's called the unconditional or unconditioned stimulus. So I'm not gonna bore you with the terms. I'm just gonna show that I'm just gonna say that this is something that is already there. However, the dog might see this bell for the first time. There is no meaning for this bell ringing. So the dog does not have any association with this bell ringing. Like there is no meaning behind this ringing, and it doesn't trigger any kinds of memories. So what Pavlov was saying, maybe if we can just present the food and the bell at the same time, we make an association between these two events, between these two things, between the food and between the bell. If we just present them together. So this basically what Pavlovian conditioning is. So you would present them together, and then you would get the food, and the dog will get the food, and then they will be presented together, and then the dog will get the food. They will see the bell, and then they get the food. Okay, and then after repeated experiments, after repeated like pairings, the dog, Pavlov would say that there is now a link or an internal link between the bell and the food, such that the dog will now treat the bell as a food. And this is what they do in the last stage, like the test. So when you present the bell itself, the dog now will salivate. So this is basic idea of how we can study the idea, how we can study the association between two events. So this was one way of looking at things. We know that there are other ways. So we know that in operant conditioning, or this is a very technical name for the idea that voluntary behavior. How do animals and people learn the relationship between what they do and the consequences of their actions, such that they will change what they do to maximize their rewards. This kind of vocabulary is pretty similar to what a reinforcement agent does. So a reinforcement agent, they have like some set of actions, and then they want to figure out what kind of actions they can do to maximize the expectation or the expected reward. So this is actually an idea that's based on the Skinnerian or the operant conditioning paradigm. By the way, like if you want to go back to the history, like operant conditioning actually dates back to 1911, way back to 1911, with a guy named Thorndike. So Thorndike is actually the first one to think about operant conditioning and how voluntary behaviors and how like voluntary behaviors would actually be linked to the consequences, so such that people or animals would learn to behave in ways that maximize their survival. So if you think about this Pavlovian learning or a Pavlovian conditioning, what is the computational goal that we are trying to say here? Like, why do we need to talk about this? So, a computational goal, like this is really the core idea why this is why animals can predict their surroundings. They can predict what happens in the future because you want to predict the occurrence of important events. An animal, if the animal cannot predict the occurrence of predators, then they will be they will be killed before they know it. However, if they are able to predict those events before they happen, now they have the ability to escape and to prepare. And that's the same logic for predicting reward. So if they know that they're gonna get a reward out of given situation, they need to know how to predict this reward. So this is the kind of computational goal of this Pavlovian learning. However, we cannot study this process directly. That's why we have Pavlovian conditioning and the dog and the food, because this is the simplest scenario where you can study those kind of computational goals. And if you can think of an algorithm, so people in the beginning were thinking that this prediction of the important events maybe is carried out by the co-occurrence between of two events. So if two events like the bill and the meat they co-occur together, maybe there is an association between them that will actually increase. So people have this idea that, oh, okay, maybe it's when they happen together, when they occur together, then there is an association between them that will grow with the experience. The idea that actually have changed not just psychology but also have a very serious implication on reinforcement learning and in neuroscience was discovered between 1961 and 1972. So what was happening in psychology? So let's imagine that you have this rat. Okay, so this rat or this mouse, they first see the light, okay, and then they get the food. So now they already know that this is like the bill with the meat. So whenever they see the light, they know that they're gonna get the food, so that they will go to the cheese place, or if that food is actually put in some like pallet, the food pallet. So now we know that the light means food, at least in the mind of this mouse. Imagine now, along with the light, you add the sound, like say a white noise or a specific tone, and you present those together, and you also follow that with the food. You're still following that with the food, okay? And you also do this multiple times. So now the light and the sound, then you give the food, the light and the sound, you give the food, and you do this over and over and over. When you just play the sound, what do you think the animal will do? Do you think the animal will anticipate the cheese? It will go to the cheese place? Or do you think the animal will actually not care about the cheese? So this finding, though, so scientists found that the what happens was that the animal will not actually anticipate any cheese. So when you have this sound at the end, the animal, it will look like the animal did not learn anything about the sound and the cheese. So if we think about the co-occurrence, the algorithm that we just said, the co-occurrence of two events will make you learn about these two events, then this actually, it doesn't look like it is sufficient to explain this result. Because now you see that the sound have actually co-occurred with the cheese all the time. And yet the animal is not able to learn or to go to anticipate a cheese when they hear the sound by itself. So this is something called psychologists called blocking. That means like the light will block the sound. So this phenomena, although it might look very very simple, or it might look very very hard to understand, it just means that we don't learn much from the redundant stimuli. So if there's something that is redundant, we don't really learn much from that redundant cue. We only learn from things that create a surprise. This is the key idea now. So these two guys, Skoll and Wagner, they actually thought of maybe we can come up with a new learning rule that will describe what is happening. And this learning rule now is based on the surprise. So the change in the relationship between two events is actually you have the learning rate, as we talked about. But then the term in red, this is actually a very important term, because now this is the prediction error. So the outcome means whether they get the food or not, whether they get the reward or not, minus the prediction whether they're gonna get the food or not. So this is something should remind this is something that should remind you with the perceptron rule, because they actually kind of use that rule now to understand what is happening in this situation. Although it's not identical, like if you go to the details, but the spirit, it's similar to that rule in the spirit, that there is a prediction error between and this prediction error is the thing that actually derives learning. So that means if you are surprised, so that means if you are surprised by the outcome, you will learn the relationship between the your current situation and that outcome. If you are not surprised, you're not gonna learn anything. So keep in mind that those guys, those are psychologists. They study the animals. They study animal learning. They when they develop these models, they don't really think about this model as a neural model. They don't really say much about the brain. What they are saying, is that for this learning to happen, for this kind of behavior, say blocking or any kind of behavior, for this behavior to happen, this kind of calculation must be the calculation that have to be carried out in the brain of that animal. We don't really know much about how it is carried out, about any details, but we know that this is a more mechanistic mechanistic level of explanation of what kind of calculations that should be carried out in the brain of the animal. And well, it didn't really take that long before this rule. So one limitation with this learning rule, one limitation is that you cannot use this rule to predict what is going to happen at the next second or at the next minute. So one of the pioneers of reinforcement learning, this is really the birth of reinforcement learning, like at least from the modern point of view, is that we're gonna take this Scholar-Wagner model. We're gonna take this function or this learning rule, and make it into something that will make agents or animals or humans learn what is going to happen at the next second. Okay, so this is the key idea here, that it is called the temporal difference learning. And the development of this rule was really inspired by psychology, was really inspired by Scholar-Wagner. So Richard Sutton, he's actually the developer of this model. He was thinking about psychology, thinking about the results in Richard Sutton. So this is one of the ways how psychology have actually influenced the development of AI models. So this is he just made, among other things, he made a new prediction error rule, which will actually which you will be able to predict what is going to happen at the next second or the next time point, and then at the next time point you're gonna predict what is going to happen at the time point after that. So it might seem a kind of trivial development, but this development was actually a very important in the history of learning. And why it is important is so this is because of the following. So if you this is I will try to yeah. So if you have this situation where in the baseline, this is actually the first time point, a queue. This is where you present something. This is where you present, like, say, a bill, or you present a light. And then at the time of the reward, this is where you show the outcome, the meat, or the whatever that outcome is, the reward. So if you take that model, the temporal difference model, in the beginning, of learning, you with that model, you will have a positive prediction error. This is actually prediction error. You will see a positive prediction error at the time of the reward. And the reason is because, well, you can see that I have a reward at the time of the prediction error. That's I didn't have a reward before that. So all those values were zeros. But at the time of the reward, I get like a value of 1 here. And now I have a positive prediction error. So now I update my predictions. So this is in the very beginning of learning. However, toward the end of learning, so now we have repeated this bill or this light with this cheese many times. Now, what happens in this model, according to this model, when the animal or when the human see the cue, this is where you see the prediction error. Because I didn't expect that I'm going to see the cue now. But when the cue arrives, when the reward is expected, you don't really see any prediction error. When the reward is expected, because you're not surprised. So as we said, like learning here, we think that learning here is driven by surprise. So that's why you don't see any change in the prediction error signal. And finally, there is the third case. This is called the negative prediction error. So this is where you show the cue, but I'm not going to show you the cheese. I'm not going to show you the reward. So you will be surprised by the absence of that cue. You'll be surprised by the absence of that cue. And the model, the TD model, and also the Scholar-Wagner model, they would predict that first you would have a positive prediction error at the time of the cue because you didn't expect that you're going to see the cue at this moment. But then at the time of the reward, you are expecting some cheese, but then you are not getting the cheese. So there is going to be a negative prediction error. So people have this idea that this kind of calculation, this have to be carried out somewhere, but they don't have any idea where or how. And in 1993, scientists found out that the dopamine neurons in a part of the brain called the ventral tegmental area. So this is a part in the deep inside the brain. There are neurons called dopamine neurons, and they actually signal exactly this kind of behavior. So after, when the reward is unexpected at the beginning of learning, you can see this shift, like there are more dots. So these dots, like how many times a neuron will fire. Okay, so the more dots, the more firing at this time. And then you see many lines. That means like repeated trials. And what you can see that in the beginning, that there are more firings when the reward is happening, because they didn't really expect that reward. So now they associate that cue with that reward. When that reward is now learned, when I learned that this bell will mean cheese is coming, now this kind of firing, this kind of prediction error will go back when I see the cue. However, when there is a reward, there isn't really any change in the baseline firing. And finally, you will see that same behavior when there is a negative prediction error or omission of that reward, because you will be surprised by the absence of that reward. And as you can see here, there is actually a white bar or a white area. That means the neurons were actually inhibited, or there was no firing for that period of time. So this was a winning moment for the for neuroscience community, for the reinforcement learning community, for the psychology community. This was a winning moment because now they can see they had this idea of prediction error like for 30 years or for 20 years at that time point. However, they it was just kind of a bet that this have to be carried out in the brain. They didn't really have any evidence that this is indeed what is happening in the inside the head of the animal. So this was the first time that they see a hard evidence that this mechanism is indeed the mechanism by which animals actually learn. So as you can see, people were very excited after this result, and then that's why you always, whenever you read about reinforcement learning, you always hear about the dopamine, about the positive prediction, about the reward prediction error. There were a lot of these kind of publications and theories, especially in the reinforcement side of things, because this is actually this finding is actually the thing that drives those kind of efforts. They know that whatever we find in our reinforcement model, this could have practical implications on how the dopamine is actually functioning in the brain of the animal. And indeed, like a lot of the companies, like say in DeepMind, they actually spend a good amount. They have a good amount of papers just talking about properties of the dopamine and modeling of the dopamine. And this is just, as I said, one of the winning moments in the history for computational neuroscience, or for reinforcement learning, or and for psychology, because for what happens here. So now, after this story, I mean, this all history just to get to this victory. I want to shift my attention to like other parts that have analogs between neuroscience and between AI. And the first one is in what happens in the visual cortex. So we know since the 50s and 60s, like 1958 to 62, with the work of Hubel and Wiesel, that there are symbol cells and there are complex cells. So what they did, they put a cat. They record from the visual cortex. This is the visual cortex, the area that responsible for vision, and they record from specific neuron. So now they will know when this neuron will fire. And then they show the cat a lot of stuff. They showed the cat a lot of stuff. And one thing they found, that there are cells that will only fire if you show the cat a line at a specific orientation. Otherwise, it doesn't fire. You have to show that line at that specific orientation. And then they did actually many of the subsequent studies, and they came up, it became clear that the visual cortex, there is a hierarchy in the visual cortex, the hierarchy of features. So when there is an image, let's say that you have a square or a rectangle, okay, the way that neurons in the earlier in the very first layer in the visual cortex, they are only sensitive the very simple features like the lines, okay. And now in the layer after that, you will have a kind of more complex features. So you will combine those features. As you can see now, we have edges, we can have like all kinds of angles, and you will actually keep doing this up to a point where you have more complex shapes. So for example, you have this kind of rectangle or this star. So this kind of this is actually the beginning of this idea of hierarchy. People know that this is something in the brain. This is like how the visual cortex must process the outside world. And as you know, like in the convolutional neural networks, there are what we call feature maps. So if you're not familiar, these are the convolutional neural networks where this is like, if you want to classify an image, you would actually make a neural network that is takes convolutions, and then you make these feature maps. So the research in those feature maps, what they mean, like what they represent, people have found out that these feature maps, they actually kind of uh, very similar to what is happening in that hierarchy of the visual cortex. So if you take the first convolutional layer, the feature maps, you might see those kind of features. Those are called the low level features, where you just have like lines and orientations. There isn't really much happening in there. And then those features will be there will be like a max pooling or some kind of operations, and then you will have another convolutional layer, and in this layer you will see more more elaborate features like the eye, you see the nose, you see the ear, and now you keep in mind that those features will be composed of those simple features. And now, if you keep doing this, you will see the high level features. You see like neurons that are that they represent faces. So these are the high level features, that the faces. So this kind of analog between the
Fahad,
convolutional. Yeah.
we are running out of time. Can we start the question, or there are a few slides yet?
Well, I guess so. This is actually one of the analogs. I just wanted to talk about it.
Okay.
This is the last slide. The hippocampus. There is when you sleep, like there is this kind of replay, experience replay, where you replay the experiences that you have been through. And this kind of mechanism was actually borrowed into the design of one of the deep reinforcement learning agents that DeepMind designed, and it won a lot of the Atari games by just enabling the algorithm to replay the samples of experience. So this is also a very interesting case of how borrowing ideas from neuroscience will actually improve the agents. So what I would say here is this symbiotic relationship continues to flourish, but we know that there is a long way to go before we can understand the brain. And I want to say, what does it mean to understand the brain anyway? Now that we have this more complicated, more sophisticated notion of what understanding the brain might look like. So I will take questions now. If you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fahad, for all your time and your very valuable information. We really do appreciate this. We have some questions from the attendees, and the first question was, what are the main techniques or methods of computing brain activity or the dopamine signals in the brain or something like this?
The main techniques or of computing computing what?
The main technique or methods of computing brain activity or the dopamine signals in the brain.
Yeah. So yeah, this is actually, if you think back, about the levels of computations, you're asking about what is the at the second level, what is the algorithm or what is the representation. And what I will say, you have to tell me what the goal is. Like, this is the reason why the question might be vague, like what is the kind of technique that the brain used to process, because we don't know about the computational goal. So if you are talking about, say, the reinforcement learning, where the computational goal is maximize, like say, the reward, okay, the maximize the reward in the future. So now we can talk about those techniques. So in those techniques, as we saw, the temporal difference algorithm was actually one of those techniques. And we saw like a very close similarity between how this algorithm works and how dopamine works in the brain. But that's actually tied to the goal of predicting the future events to maximize the rewards. So this is what I would say to this question.
I got it. Okay, the second question we had from our attendees: any recommended reading or psychology and learning? Any recommended reading can you give us on psychology and learning?
Well, absolutely. Usually the material, like I know that in DeepMind, they really have a beautiful set of series in their website about this interaction between psychology and AI. So if you want to see those parallels, you can go into those. If you want to learn more about psychology and the history of learning in psychology, then you can find any textbook, really, any textbook about learning, about animal learning, or but by the way, like you might find animal learning in the title, but it's really about learning. It doesn't really have to be about the animals. It could be applied to humans, and it is definitely relevant to reinforcement learning.
Okay, thanks. And our last question was: can neuroscience help us understand why AI and neural networks are effective at emulating human perceptions?
Well, the reason why we use the AI, if you think back about the levels of analysis, we assume there is a kind of independence between the algorithm and between the implementation. And it's incredibly hard to go and study the brains and like ablate lesions. We can lesion this place and see what it does. You cannot do this with living people. So the reason why AI is really important, especially those models, what I showed you about the visual hierarchies, like how people use those convolutional neural networks to study the human vision or to study vision. This is actually the key contribution of how AI could actually be used to advance our understanding of the human brain, and especially of the computational goals of those systems of vision. So if this is the computational goal, then what happens if I get rid of this part? Then what happens if I do that? So this is something that have been very active area of research, and that's, I guess, the reason why we would love to have both AI and neuroscience.
Okay, one more question. Sorry. What is the state of the art in modeling emotions?
State of the art in modeling emotion. So it really depends on what you mean by modeling emotions. If you mean that by predicting emotional states from facial expressions, so this is something I think there are like models that does that. Uh, but this is basically a way, like kind of not a very scientific question, because you just have like input data and then you just make a classifier to classify the emotions based on the faces. So it's not much interest in neuroscience about that kind of thing. However, if you think about if I look at the brain activity, if I use an fMRI, if I look at the brain activity, then can I tell what kind of emotion this person is feeling just by looking at the brain activity? then this is indeed something that is gaining popularity. So people have been using the deep learning models to do just that. So they make like a classification model of brain activity and the emotions. And usually those models, when they do these models and then they look at the weights, they will actually tell something really interesting about the patterns of neural activity and how they relate to emotional states. I know that this is very well studied in pain. So in pain, this is a very salient parts of the brain that fire. Like it is a kind of a very good work, because it shows you what kind of a good model look like when we're talking about emotions and the brain. So you should start by looking at pain or neural signatures of pain and how deep learning is used in that area.
Okay, great. That sounds good. So we have one more question from Abdel Ilah. Abdel Ilah.
Yes, Dr. Fahad, thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative, very pleasing. My question is from, I have a couple of questions. The first one relates, and I'm searching for your opinion on that, not actually for facts. It's just your personal opinion on if we look at the state of AI and the researchers in this field, they're trying eventually, if we could assume that most of the research eventually looking for reaching AGI or artificial general intelligence state, right? If someone can get to it first, it's going to be the best, say, breakthrough in the field. Now, we've seen recently the progress in language models, GPT-3 and the sorts of progress. And we've seen some let's say, slowdown in the reinforcement learning field, kind of. Maybe it's just my perception, but what do you think is happening to the reinforcement learning field? And in terms of AGI, what do you think will push the research in this field towards AGI? Is it going to be language models, or is it going to be more of the reward-based systems in reinforcement learning? And the second question is, if we focus on the reward systems of reinforcement learning, and we do reach the level of AGIs, let's say the example of the let's say the mouse that's looking for the cheese, to eat the cheese, and the reward basically is to eat cheese, right? So if there were obstacles, we would usually model them through constraints, right? So unless there is an obstruction or a wall, go eat the cheese, right? But if eventually the goal of the AGI is to maximize the reward, wouldn't that risk or present any risks in terms of actually damaging the surrounding environment related to this AGI? What's your opinion? What are your thoughts on these two subjects?
Yeah, actually, thanks for the question. They are really great questions. I love them. So for the first question, I think it will be in reinforcement learning, because if you think about the goal of natural language processing or natural language modeling, it's basically a very limited to natural language. However, if you look at the reinforcement learning is basically diagnostic, basically agnostic to what is the problem, what is the kind of representation. So that's why you see some reinforcement learning approach to in natural language processing. You see reinforcement learning approach in image classification. You see reinforcement approach in all kinds of AI, because the thing that will really, if there is an AGI, which I'm not like 100% sure about, but if there is an AGI, it will be an AGI where AI agents can flexibly change their behavior, can adapt with their environment. They can have self-interest. They can move. They think about different tasks. They move from one task to other. They deal with the challenges. And this kind of flexibility is extremely hard. And even for the reinforcement field right now, it's still very hard. Like people are still trying to theorize like what this should look like, what kind of computational goals should we set for a system to be as flexible as this, because if we are any closer to AGI, the agent must have these kind of goals. It must be flexible and adaptive to the environment. So this is answering your first question. For the second question, you are also right, because it really depends on how you define the reward. The agent, if it's unconstrained, it will just figure out what kind of actions that will maximize this reward. Then it will figure out whatever actions that will maximize this reward, even if those actions will actually damage the agent. So there was an interesting example in one of the OpenAI papers, where the agent is actually they actually, instead of the reward function being collecting the coins along a defined course, they define the reward function as I think something like passing, making a certain speed or something like. It is something that is not directly related to the problem. So the agent was like a racing car. It kept moving in circles. So this is because this is how it was maximizing the reward or avoiding the punishment. So if you think about a real life example, if like say Tesla, for example, if Tesla were actually using reinforcement learning in their cars, I would extremely be worried about that system, because I would ask like, what is exactly being maximized? And because if that thing being maximized is not met in reality, then the car will do whatever it does to actually win. But that's why it's not really being used. It's not really being used. They actually used more like supervised learning. However, the people who might be using reinforcement learning might be like, say, recommendation systems in YouTube, because you have to think about what it would look like for a recommendation system to use reinforcement learning, and the reward signal would be like how many like say how many videos you are gonna watch, or how long you're gonna stay. So that, for me, I don't really have like a detailed knowledge of what kind of recommendation system they use, and they don't really release that anyway. But I think I would also be extremely worried if they learn kind of reward maximization approach, because that will keep people in the same loop, and this is maybe how they can be radicalized. So this is just a kind of different approach. Like you don't have, when you think about reinforcement learning, you don't have to think about agents and robots, and these algorithms are actually being used in today, like in innovative ways. So this is what I would say, that yeah, it would definitely be a very high risk. And if this is something that will be used in public, then the definition of the reward function should be public, and people should know what is being maximized.
That was very informative. Thank you, Fahad.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Fahad, for sharing your knowledge with us, and thank you for all our attendance today. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we. And don't forget to follow us on our Twitter account to keep you updated. And see you soon.